quick recap. Let's kind of recap over what we've learned the past 2 weeks. The first week we talked about Alexander the Great and essentially the Hellenization of Palestine and really the overall Mediterranean area. And by Hellenization, I mean the Greek infusion in culture. So the philosophy, education, especially the language, common coinage. There was a melting pot that begins to happen within the Mediterranean, the Near East, because Alexander the Great conquered all these lands. And we feel that within the Palestinian region, through the Jewish people, because now they have this growing pressure of their religious, cultural, economic lives are being pressed in upon, right? Their lives are being challenged. Their ways of living are being challenged, right? They have been called to live as God's covenant people, and now there are these conquerors who are coming in and saying, hey, you should be just like us. You should stop circumcising your kids, worship the gods that we worship, do what we do as we're going along. So there's the kind of the cultural pressures. Last week we learned about the Hasmonean dynasty, then we learned about the Herodian dynasty, and it was kind of us figuring out a bit of the political and religious pressures that are going on, right? We learned about how in the Hasmoneans, let's go back a little bit, the Hasmoneans are rebelling against the Seleucids. It's a Greek kingdom. They kind of cause a strife. They're fighting those guys, and they come along, and we feel kind of more the political pressures and the religious pressures. I left you last week. We didn't finish all of last week's lecture, so we're going to jump into that right now. I spoke to you about the four Jewish philosophies. That is a term that Josephus, the Jewish Roman historian, used to describe the different sects or the different groups, different parties within the Palestinian world. So you have the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the Essenes, and the Zealots. Those are the kind of the four groups, but we're also going to add in the Samaritans because it's very helpful for us to know that. We talked about the Pharisees. The Pharisees are a religious group who are trying to live as holy as they possibly can in order, in their view, to maybe if they live holy enough, if they live righteous enough, they will obey the covenant enough, the Messiah will come, he will remove the conquerors, the Gentiles, out of the land. So if they are religious enough, maybe they can get along. Maybe Yahweh will come back. I talked about the Sadducees last week. These are the religious elite. These are the political elite. These are the guys that are in charge. They're the high priests. They are the people who have the influence. They're kind of like I said, they're the East Coast, West Coast elites. The Pharisees are kind of your MAGA middle country people. They're a bit of the working class people. And these two groups are feuding. These two guys, the Pharisees and the Sadducees, do not like each other. That's a very important thing to have in your mind as you're reading scriptures. You're fine. They changed the pulpit on me, so it's a little bit bigger than normal. So let's talk about a group called the Essenes. The Essenes. Now the Essenes, does anybody know who the Essenes are? Has anybody heard of the Essenes? Heard of them? Here's the thing. You will not find the Essenes in the Bible, in the New Testament. They're nowhere mentioned, at least not explicitly, by some people's opinions. At least not explicitly are they mentioned in the Bible. But these are a group of people who, in the time of the Hasmoneans, they began to move out of the cities, move out of the normal culture, and they run to the hills, and they live in a set of caves. And there's a lot of varying groups. If you read about these guys, there's usually not one small, everybody we know is in this group. This is the Essenes. But it seems like there's different sects and different little groups. These are the people that lived in the Qumran caves. And if you know about the Dead Sea Scrolls, these are the people that wrote the Dead Sea Scrolls. Now, there's even some debate about that. Who wrote those? how were those written, what were those people's beliefs. But we find lots and lots of biblical and also other religious text within the Qumran caves. So 1940 something, there was a little shepherd boy named Muhammad. He was running around the caves. He was throwing rocks in the caves. He throws a rock. He hears a clunk, or he hears a clang rather than a blunk, right? He realizes there's something in there. He goes in there and he finds one of the most important archaeological finds in world history, right? Some guy tells us that, I heard some professor say that it helped us take back our knowledge of the Hebrew language back 1,000 years. So what we knew about was from like around 1200, and it took us back all the way to 200. So our understanding of Hebrew, our understanding of other religious texts, these guys loved the prophets. So there's Isaiah, there's lots of Isaiah, there's lots of Jeremiah and Ezekiel, there's lots of Psalms. These guys love the Psalms. So they're writing scripture. So these are kind of your monastical, mystical, think kind of a Greek Orthodox monastical guy that ran out to the caves, and he's living out there, and he's trying to live as holy as he can possibly do. These guys are very apocalyptic. They're very eschatological. Now, I'm not saying that the Pharisees weren't. They believe that the eschaton, the last age, was the Messiah coming, but their eschatological view is like, we will live very distinct. We will live absolutely distinct from the Pharisees and the Sadducees. So the Pharisees and the Sadducees, as much as they don't like each other, they kind of go, but you're trying to do your good Jewish thing. The Essenes are saying, no. We are the true Jews. We are the true righteous ones, because we are the ones that are going as far as we possibly can with our holiness. They had a practice that every year you would basically take a test on your knowledge of the truth, the knowledge of the Bible, and then you were ranked accordingly from the highest knowledge to the lowest knowledge. And then you sat in that order, so you always knew what the pecking order was, which I just love that concept, that you're like, hey, you're number 4, you're number 5, you better not step out of line, number 5, because we're going to put you in your place, literally. So the Essenes are this very, very holy and righteous people. They had some kooky beliefs, we would say, but they were communal. They lived in the desert. They were eschatological. They believed in the Tanakh. They believed in the oral tradition. If you remember that, the Pharisees believed in the oral tradition as well as the Torah, meaning that there was these codes and commands that Moses gave that we didn't write down yet until about 200 AD. So the Essenes are doing that. There is one Essene that we might see in the Bible. Can anybody take a guess on who we might think is an Essene? Who? John the Baptist. There's a theory that John the Baptist is an Essene. Why are we thinking that that's the case? Well, first off, if you think about this, he was a part of the priesthood family. These are a lot of priests that ran out into the desert. He had older parents, so I'm guessing that they died when he was pretty young. And the Essenes were famous for taking care of orphans. And then where's the first place that we see this cat? In the desert, right? And what is he preaching? He's preaching righteousness. He's preaching an eschatological message. He's preaching that the end is near. You ought to repent because the king is coming. Please return. He's baptizing. The Essenes were famous for their baptismal kind of practices. So they had, even though they were in their deserts, they had these running kind of water systems that they filled up these water founts with so that they could do their ritual cleaning on a regular basis. Now, John the Baptist's baptism is a baptism of what? Repentance. So his baptism is a baptism of repentance, and it's a baptism of initiation. Jesus' baptism is, hey, you're being initiated. So it's a little bit different than their baptism. All right, we're going to skip the Samaritans for a second. We're going to go to the fourth Jewish philosophy, which is the Zealots. The Zealots are a religious group, but they're much more a revolutionary political group. So I spoke to you that in the Hasmonean dynasty, you had a guy named Mattathias. He killed a Seleucid politician, and he killed a priest because he wanted his people to be holy and righteous and not to bow the knee to any other false gods. Well, the Zealots thought that was a really great idea. So the Zealots are a running group, and you can't really think of them as one continual group. It seems like they kind of come in waves, and there's like they're happy to fight for a little while, then they kind of get crushed, and then they go down, and they get angry again, and they come back up. So in about 4 AD, there was a guy named Judas the Galilean. Judas the Galilean. He started a bit of a revolt in Galilee. He rises up. He starts killing folks, starts killing Romans. The Herods don't like this at all, so they kind of crush this rebellion. And we hear of this guy, Judas, in the book of Acts. In the book of Acts, you hear from Gamaliel. He's talking about, they're talking about Jesus. What are they going to, or they're talking about the apostles. What are they going to do with these guys? Is this a move of God? Is this not a move of God? Gamaliel stands up and he says, you know what, guys? We've seen when people try to rise up and they get crushed. And we know that's not a movement of God. But he says, I think we should let this kind of be. We should see what happens with this whole Jesus movement. Because if it's not a movement of God, it'll be crushed. But if it is a movement of God, we don't want to stand against it. So this movement, these zealots, are this political group. They were known for going into Jerusalem, especially during the festivals, and they would have daggers and they would stab Roman citizens or they would stab priests because they're trying to foment revolution, right? They're trying to take over through their political revolution. So these are kind of wild guys. We really don't know much about them. There's a zealot in the New Testament. His name is Simon the Zealot. So I heard a guy, his argument was that he wasn't really one of the political revolutionaries. I heard another guy say that he was. I'd like to think that he is. Who knows? We can't really determine. Was he zealous because he was religiously zealous, or was he a zealot because he was a part of this group? That's kind of the argument. But think about this. Think about how wild this is. You have Matthew, who's a tax collector, right? The absolute scum of the earth if you're a Jew, right? You absolutely hate the tax collector because he's working on the side of the Gentiles. And oftentimes tax collectors are taking more than they ought. They're crooked. They're nasty people because they're taking money away from the good Jewish communities and giving them to the Gentile pagans. And Jesus says, I'm going to take a tax collector and I'm going to take a zealot and I'm going to make them a part of my kingdom building project because I want to take everybody from every single corner of the world and I want to bring them together under my kingdom. So really revolutionary what Jesus is doing right here. Lastly, the Samaritans. The Samaritans are a group that we hear a lot about in the New Testament, but when you look at Jewish history, if you just look at the Bible, you're not going to really learn about who they are, how they come about, because you hear who they are. They're Samaritans, and the Jews don't like them. Well, where did they come from? Well, the Assyrians take the top 10 tribes from the north in like 700 BC. They go away. Well, the Assyrians, what they would do is they would take a handful of other tribes and people and nations, and they would just kind of mix them all around in their kingdom. So there's these Jews that are the remnants left in Israel. They bring in new people. These people intermarry. We kind of see that, a bit of that remnant in Ezra and Nehemiah. We learn that story. But we know that from other extra biblical pieces of knowledge. But then they have this mixed group of people. Now, here's what's the interesting thing. If you read about the Samaritans, if you hear about them only from the New Testament, how the Jews didn't like them, you'd go, they must be really wacky people. They must be really bizarre. But from what we know about the Samaritans, they seem like they're pretty solid people. They love the Torah. They obey the Torah. The only difference is they have a temple that is on Mount Gerizim. Does anybody remember the story of Jesus at the well with the Samaritan woman? The woman says, you worship over there. We worship over here. Which one should we be worshiping at? And Jesus says, you're worrying about the wrong things. There will be a day when God is calling people to worship him in spirit and in truth. And wherever you are, you could be worshiping God. Now, these people were waiting for a Messiah. They were waiting for a teacher, a person to come. And what does she say? She says, we know that there's a prophet that is to be revealed. And Jesus basically says, I am the one that you've been looking for, right? So he comes as the hope of the Samaritans as much as he comes as the hope to the Pharisees, the Sadducees, and the Zealots, even though they might be looking for it in a very obscure way. So the Samaritans, even today, they have a temple that's out on Mount Gerizim. They do Levitical type sacrifices on a regular basis. Like you would look at these guys and you go, they seem like solid Jews, even though they might be intermingled. They might not have the the pure blood is what some Jews might want to have kind of in their mind, but they're not terrible people. So the Samaritans, you kind of want to compare them to the Jehovah Witness, or it's kind of an offshoot, but they're really more orthodox than that, if I had to make, once again, an anachronistic comparison. So, why is all this important? It's very important because when we see in the Gospels, we hear a passage like this, John chapter 11, 47 through 57. So the chief priests and the Pharisees gathered the council and said, what are we to do? Now remember, who are the chief priests? What party are they? Sadducees. So it's saying the Sadducees and the Pharisees gathered in the council, or the Sanhedrin, and said, what are we to do? For this man performs many signs, and if we let him go on like this, everyone will believe him. And the Romans will come and take away both our place and our nation. But one of them, Caiaphas, who was the high priest that year, said to them, you know nothing at all, nor do you understand that it is better for one man should die for the people than the whole nation should perish. Verse 51, he did not say this of his own accord, but being high priest that year, he prophesied that Jesus would die for the nation, and not for the nation only, but for also to gather into one the children of God who are scattered abroad. So from that day, they made plans to put him to death. Jesus therefore no longer walked openly among the Jews, but went there to the region near the wilderness to a town called Ephraim, and there he stayed with his disciples. So how politically dangerous must Jesus be? How revolutionary he must be in their sight if both the Pharisees and the Sadducees are looking together and say, we got to get rid of this guy. And what was their motivation? What did they say? Why didn't they want people to believe in him? What was their thinking? The Romans. If we don't stop this guy, the Romans are going to come down here and they're going to crush us. We already had a few years ago, there's a boy from Galilee named Judas. I just talked about him. He's kicked off a little revolution, and we know how that went. We can't let this happen again. There's another Galilean wanting to kick stuff off. We have to crush him. And so what do? They send him to the cross. But he spoke a prophecy. He said that he will die for the nation. Now in his head, he's thinking, well, why not just kill this one guy just so that we can keep on keeping our motivation and our agenda going? But God, just like God can speak through a donkey, he can speak through a high priest who is, his heart is far from Yahweh, and he can speak a prophecy that he will be a sacrifice for the nations. So we should take away this sense that when we understand the cultural, the historical, the political movements, we have a greater understanding of Jesus' ministry. Remember last week, if you were here, I compared that the greater that we can understand the biblical context, the political, historical, religious context of the Bible, we go from just a little tube television, then we jump up to maybe like a 1080p, and then eventually we can maybe move to 4K, and then maybe to 8K, and eventually it's just so crystal clear, it's looking like we can go in and we can touch the biblical characters. That's what I'm hoping that we get out here. So I want the resolution to understand as you're reading Scripture, it's clearer and clearer. All right, Jesus' approaches to the kingdom and the means by which it will come are diametrically opposed to that of his contemporaries. The other people want to do it through some sort of external religiosity. Some people want to do it through some sort of political revolution. We want to foment violence. We want to bring about this overturning of the Romans. The Essenes say, let's run away. Let's go out into the desert. Let's hide there. Jesus' ministry is much more different. It's yeast in a lump of dough. It's a slow takeover. It's a slow fermentation of his kingdom that will slowly take over. The same kingdom that oppressed the Jews will be the same kingdom that Jesus topples. And he does that through basically the Roman culture becoming Christian. So that's what we're going to talk about today, right? I just finished last week's lesson. Today we're going to talk about the Romans. The Romans are absolutely fascinating. The more that I learn about them, the more and more I want to learn about them. They're absolutely fascinating. They have shaped Western culture in such huge dynamic ways between Romans, the Roman Empire, Christianity, and the Greeks, we are who we are because of that three-legged stool, right? This is what we have become as a society, and a lot of people don't like that, but you can't fight that reality. That's the truth. All right, so we're going to talk about the Roman Empire today. I'm going to walk you through the early history, kind of the primitive history. So they're the city that sits on 7 hills. In Revelation 17:9, it says that the 7 beasts are the 7 hills on which the whore sits on, something like that. And so it's speaking explicitly of the Roman city. It's speaking of Rome. Rome is the city of 7 hills. And if you look online, this is what a fascinating thing, if you're ever bored. If you go on Wikipedia, there are dozens and dozens of cities that claim to be the city of 7 hills, right? So I think the Romans kicked it off, and everybody else is like, that's a great idea. So like Athens, Georgia, and all these other, there's like a city in Ohio that claims to be the city of 7 hills. Look it up. You'll get lost. It's a rabbit trail. It's fun. All right. So they were started by a group of mythological, maybe there's a little bit of historical reality to these, a set of twins, boys named Romulus and Remus. Romulus and Remus are said to be demigods with the god Ares, the god of war, or Mars, and that in their case, Ares was the Greek name Mars. So they are kicked out of their earthly father's house. They're taken care of by a she-wolf. Does anybody know the story of the she-wolf? This story, this little statue right here, it's a wolf, and these little boys are suckling on the she-wolf. So it's this story that they take over, they are raised by the she-wolf, they grow up, they're going to build a city. One brother says we should build it on this hill, the other says we should build it on this hill. They get mad at each other. Romulus kills them, right? So the perpetual feud of brothers is not just in the Bible, but it's everywhere. So Romulus starts it off, he becomes the first king, and they build this little place. They were called, the area that they were in was Latinium, and they spoke the language of Latin. So that's the language of the Romans. So they're growing, they start to war with the local colony or nations around them. So they defeat the Etruscans. Eventually they kick out the Greeks out of Italy. So the Greeks have colonies everywhere in the Mediterranean. The Greeks are just absolutely nuts for a colony and a silver mine. So they kick them out of there and they begin to grow. Eventually they get rid of their kings and they become a republic, and they will be run by the Senate. Well, eventually the people say, hey, we want a little bit of say in this. So they become a group that is run by the Senate and the Roman people. And I don't know if I wrote this down, but there's the Latin phrase that essentially means the Senate and the Roman people is where you get the SPQR. And you're going to see that a lot in Rome. They would carry, in their standards where they're marching to war, you're going to see SPQR. Essentially, it's some Latin phrase. I don't know how to speak it. I'm sorry. For the Senate and the Roman people. Very interesting thing about the Romans is they're extremely pious, especially in their early empirical stage. They're very holy people. There's a quote that I wrote down from a historian named Polybius. He writes this, or he says this: the quality in which the Roman Commonwealth is most distinctly superior, in my opinion, is the nature of their religious convictions. I believe that it is the very thing which, among other peoples, is an object of reproach. I mean superstition, which maintains the cohesion of the Roman state. So remember this word superstition. We're going to talk about superstition probably next week. Superstition is this idea of a personal religion. It's this personal idea of holiness and righteousness and a religious faith. And so early on, Polybius lived around 200 BC. He's a Greek historian. He's writing about the Romans. He says, you know what's so great about the Romans? These guys are righteous. These guys are holy. And that is the success of their nation, of their empire. We're going to see that goes down eventually. We'll talk about that as the Roman Empire gets more and more corrupt. The Roman people are very flexible. They're flexible in the idea that when they go into a new land, they're not going to make people be Romans. They're going to say, hey, you're going to do your thing. You're going to live your life. If you want to pay us taxes, that'd be great. And if you don't, we'll kind of crush you. But as long as you pay your taxes, you can do whatever you want. But they didn't force people to worship their gods. They didn't force people to make sacrifices. What they would do is they would take your God and say, this is our God now. We will take him on. And they had a ritual in which they would go and make sacrifices to your God, and they would say, hey, switch over to our side. We will worship you better. We will conquer on your behalf. We will. How demoralizing is that? Not only did they come in and they crush you and kill all your people, or most of your people, but then they go and say, we're going to take the God that you worship for ourselves. So they were famous for that. Or they would take your God and they would kind of co-opt it and go, oh, this is Jupiter now. Oh, this is Mars now, right? They would take your gods and just kind of scratch your label off and put on a new label saying it was their God. So they're very, very flexible, right? They can move and they can go in. And if they have something you like, they're going to kind of borrow it. That's why Hellenization or the Greek culture became so very popular in the Roman Empire. They took Greek philosophy, they picked it up, and they took it to its maximum, right? They take it, they grow it, and they absolutely love it. That's why at some point, most of the people in the Roman Empire aren't even speaking Latin, they're speaking Greek, right? And every good aristocrat spoke both Latin and Greek. Now, Latin was the language of the government. You wrote in Latin for the sake of, your documents, but the common people mostly spoke Greek. Finally, what do we want to know about the Romans? Law is everything. Law is everything. I had somebody quoted, or something I read about the Greeks were, the measure of everything is man. The measure of everything is man, meaning, who we are is the most important thing. For the Romans, the measure of everything is the law. And they had something called the 12 tables, to where in every city they had their laws written out. And it was about property rights and jurisdiction and when you should go to court and how do you get called to court and how do you have marriage and how do you have divorce. And very much of what we have as a system of law is built upon the 10 Commandments and the 12 tables. So the 2 tables and the 12 tables, right? So this is very much what we have as Western law, is what we learned from the Romans. All right. Well, let's get to some exciting stuff. The empire's growing. It's expanding. They're moving. They're growing. In about 146, they fully conquer the land of Greece. So that's within their control. Greece is popular. It's wealthy. It has a lot of cachet. It's very it's very cool to have the Greek empire on your side. Very good. And then also in the same year, in 146, they conquer Carthage. Carthage is a Phoenician empire. It's on the African coast. They take over Carthage. If you know the story of Hannibal, not Cannibal, either one. Hannibal comes over the Alps with some elephants, and they stop him before he gets to Rome. They defeat the Carthaginians, and they take over Carthage. And at that point, they basically have hold of the Mediterranean. So now, 146, the Romans are in charge. This is great. Well, what happens when you have a lot of wealth and you have a lot of influence? Well, people want it. And there begins to be this fighting. And there begins to be this instability. For about 100 years, there's wars and fighting, and there's civil wars that are going on over time. So essentially, the Senate is in charge in Rome, and they give off certain pieces of land to Roman generals, and they say, hey, you take over this area, you go here. Well, now these generals are just fighting each other constantly. We get to a point in history called where you have the first triumvirate, which is Crassus, Julius Caesar, and Pompey. These are the 3 most powerful men in the empire at that point, and they basically say, all right, we are all in charge. Let's everybody be cool. Let's be calm. We'll be okay. Pompey, he's responsible for conquering Palestine and kind of getting rid of some of the pirates that are in that eastern Mediterranean area. Julius Caesar goes up to Gaul, which is modern-day France. He murders about 1 million Gauls, and he enslaves another 1 million, is the rough estimate. So he's a pretty chill dude overall, wouldn't you say? And so this guy, after he's done doing his genocide, he comes down, and he has this moment where he has to decide what he's going to do. Is he going to take his army into Italy, which is illegal, and he's going to take Rome, or is he going to sit back? Well, if he knows that if he sits back, and he doesn't go into Rome, he's got a lot of people in Rome that hate him. He's got a lot of lawsuits that are ready to crush him, right? Or ready to take him to jail. And he knows that his money will be taken away, his fame will be taken away, and he might be killed. So he decides to it's a moment, it's called crossing the Rubicon. It's a river, he crosses the Rubicon. So have you ever heard that phrase? It's a moment where you got to cross the, that means it's you've gone and you can't go back. So he crosses the Rubicon, he enters Rome. Julius Caesar does this. So then a civil war ensues. At this point, I forgot to mention this, Crassus is dead at this point. My man, come on in. Crassus is dead at this point. So now it's Pompey, it's Julius Caesar. They're going to have a war. Julius Caesar goes down to Egypt. He's hiding away. He has a baby with Cleopatra, which is pretty fun. The baby's named Caesarea, Little Caesar. It's true. His favorite food was pizza. I don't know if you knew that. That's probably not true, but I have no way to know. I have no way of knowing if that's true or not. Okay? So there's a civil war. So all across the empire, right, it's chaotic. Romans are fighting Romans. Citizens are killing citizens. This is a terrible place to be. Well, let's take a quick break and let's learn about what's going on geographically. So you can see here, the red is where the Romans already had power in 63 BC. Now, Pompey and Julius go on rampages, right? So you can see over here in the eastern Mediterranean, he takes over Syria, he takes over Palestine, obviously, which we're most interested in. They take over more parts of Africa. He takes up over France and parts of Germany. The Gauls, by the way, are terrifying, terrifying people. I mean, these are the barbarians. They're crazy, they're wild, they'll run at you naked when they're, when they're about to war. So they're part of the Celtic people, if you're interested in that. So they begin to take over, and then as he heads into Italy, he crosses that Rubicon. Down here is Alexandria, which is where Cleopatra is reigning. She is the last Greek princess in line of Ptolemy after Alexander the Great. So she's the last Greek princess. So for the past few hundred years, the Greeks have been running, and at this point, Egypt is a client state. So basically they say, hey, you can have your own queen down there, you can kind of do your own thing, but we need your bread and we need your taxes, right? Eventually that'll be taken over, but at this point, during the Civil War, another break in the story. Pompey conquers Palestine, Syria in 63 BC. He gets to Jerusalem. There's not much of a fight. The Jews do not have the ability to fight very well. Pompey goes into the temple. He steps into the Holy of Holies, which makes it unclean. What he doesn't do is he doesn't offer sacrifices to his God. He just wants to go in and see. He goes into the Holy of Holies, and what does he see? What's he see? Nothing. Why is this baffling if you're a Roman, if you're a pagan? There's no statue of a God. Who said that? Jason, is that you? There's no statue of a God. What are you talking about? How do you not have a God in your temple? There's no God in your temple? This is bizarre. And so this really begins, the Romans would look at the Jews and call them atheists. They didn't think they really believed in a God, because if you had a God, you would have an image of a God. We've been to the temple of Zeus. We can look at him. We can go in Ephesus. We can look at Artemis, right? In my home, I have little trinkets, little idols that I worship. And so this is bizarre. But we know that God is a spirit, and we don't make graven images of him. So, really mind-blowing, baffling. He leaves the temple. He tells the high priest, go in there, clean it out, do what you got to do, make it a little bit more holy, and continue your sacrifices. So he's not as egregious as Antiochus Epiphanes, who we learned about a couple weeks ago. Or I guess that was 2 weeks ago. So he's not as outrageous as him, but he makes people mad. What happens to a city called Pompeii? Boom, right? Mount Vesuvius gets destroyed. Was it payback? Who knows? I'm not sure. I'm not God, but that's interesting, right? That's interesting. Don't go in the temple. All right. So, after Julius Caesar is killed on what day? The Ides of March, which is the 15th of March. He's killed by the Senate because Julius Caesar, after he takes control, he kills Pompey, he destroys Pompey's army. He goes into Rome and he declares himself dictator, which is the dictator was normally the person that was given control if the city was in trouble, if there were enemies at the gate. There was chosen one emperor who had one dictator who had all control, so he could do what he needed to destroy that. But then he would give that power back to the Senate. Well, it didn't seem like this guy was going to give power back to the Senate. So Brutus kills him, and the other gang, they kill him, Et Brute, right? So they kill Julius Caesar. Now there's this situation where, like, what are we going to do? So there's a group of, the second triumvirate is in charge, which is Caesar Augustus, who's it? Mark Antony, and a third guy. I forget. Does anybody remember? Anyway, there's a second triumvirate where they're going to be in charge. Well, at this point, we recognize that there's really two guys who have the chance to take over. The third guy is killed. That's why we probably don't remember his name. Mark Antony and Octavius, who is Julius Caesar's nephew, who's a general. They have another civil war. Octavius goes down, destroys Mark Antony. He's down in Egypt. He has a baby with Cleopatra. Also, strange. But so he has a baby with Cleopatra. Eventually, he's destroyed, or he's killed as well. And Octavius becomes the emperor of Rome. Now, what he does is absolutely incredible. I mean, this guy is one of the most shrewd, intelligent men in world history. He begins to consolidate power and consolidate control over the Roman Empire in such a way that people aren't feeling threatened by him, right? He kind of props himself up and says, the Senate is really in charge. The Senate is in charge, but I'm kind of ruling over in such a way that this thing doesn't fall apart. He knew that things were kind of tenuous. The things were getting a little risky for them as an empire. So as I said, he's the adopted nephew of Julius Caesar. Once he is in charge, the Senate gives him the name Augustus, which means kind of the great or superior, enlightened one. It's kind of like he's very lifted up. And he takes on the name Cassius Julius Caesar Dive Filius Augustus. He asks the Roman Senate to essentially make Julius Caesar a god. And so what he's saying is Julius Caesar, he's the son of God. So because he's basically his son, he is the son of a god, Julius Caesar, and he is the great. So he takes on this title, right? He takes on this title as the emperor, and like every few years he just gets like a new title, a new like moniker that just makes him out to be the best guy in the world. So this guy is politically shrewd, he's smart, he's wise, he's doing all the right things, and he begins to reform the Roman Empire. He does a lot of road building, so he makes sure that everywhere you go throughout the Roman Empire, you can get there quickly, you can get there swiftly, and you didn't need a passport. So if I wanted to go from Egypt to Palestine to Greece to Rome, as long as I wasn't taking goods to trade, I didn't have to pay any taxes, I didn't need a passport, I can go freely, and I was safe. Under the rule of Augustus Caesar, we are safe. And he begins to get this idea of like he is the peacekeeper. He is the one that is taking control of the world and he's bringing it into submission. He's subduing all the war. Because if you remember, like I said, for the past 100 years, there's been a civil war, there's been strife, Romans killing Romans. And so he comes and he brings peace. There's a famous Roman poet named Virgil, and he says this: "Now has come the last day of the Cumanian prophecy. The great cycle of periods is born anew. Now returns the maid, returns the reign of Saturn. Now from high heaven a new generation comes down. Yet do thou at that boy's birth, in whom the iron race shall begin to cease, and and the golden to arise over all the world. Holy Lusenia, be gracious. Now thine own Apollos reigns. He's saying this guy is a god. And he's brought about a new age. He's brought about a new time in history where we can live in peace. We can live in harmony. We have a Savior of the world. Now think about this. It is, at this point, he begins to take control about 37 AD is when or 37 BC, right? So he begins to lay down a foundation of peace in the world. He lays down, thank you so much, you said it, the Pax Romana, the Roman peace. He sets about this new epoch in Roman history where Romans are at peace with Romans. And if you lived within the bounds of the Roman Empire, life was pretty good, especially if you were a Greek, especially if you were a Roman citizen. Now, if you were a Jew, you probably didn't feel that. You didn't think that it was a Roman peace. And if you lived on the edges and you were, a Gaul, if you were if you were one of the Celtic people sitting on the edges, you probably were getting killed a lot. So you probably didn't feel the peace on your part. But if you were within the empire, if you were living in that Mediterranean closer to the water you got, the safer you were, your life was pretty nice. We live in a bit of a Pax Romana, right? We live in a time where economically we get to flourish. You get to have freedom of religion. You get to have freedom of choice. You have a Bill of Rights. Things are pretty nice for you, right? So we're feeling pretty great at this point if you're in the Roman history. Heightened expectation. I read that quote from Virgil, right? There's this idea that is a new epoch in time. Time is very cyclical in that worldview, right? The Christian worldview is one of the first worldviews that says time is linear, that we start and in the middle we're working hard. It's difficult, but we're heading to an epoch. We're heading to a climax of time, an eschaton, where things are beautiful and great. But for a lot of the worldview, it's a circle. It's a cycle. And you go through a bad time, but you're coming back around and you're going to have a good time. You go to a bad time, you're coming back around and you're a good time. So there's this sense that we are in a new age. There's stable growth. I mentioned how there's roads being built. There's building projects consistently by Caesar Augustus. The Roman army, he implements an exactitude of discipline. We're going to be regimented even more so. We're going to build up our citizen army. After you retire, you get to have a promised plot of land. So people love Caesar Augustus. As I said, he's a savior of the world. It is a bit short-lived. So if you go from about 37 BC up until about 180 AD is the time of what we know as the Pax Romana. Now in the middle of there, in the year 69 AD, you have the year of the four emperors, which is a season where three generals try to take control, and eventually Vespasian, an emperor, takes control of the emperor, of the reign of the empire. But it's this time where things are stable and safe. Now, here another quote that I thought was absolutely fascinating. It says, the spread of Christianity would have been inconceivable had Jesus been born a half century earlier. The spread of Christianity would be inconceivable had Jesus been born a half century before. If Jesus was born in 50 AD or 60 AD, by the time he dies, right, things aren't as stable, right? Or if he's born in the time of Julius Caesar, that message, once Jesus dies, that message is not going to be able to spread as easily. There's wars going on, the roads aren't as good, economically, you're not able to move around and trade as easily. If you're Paul and you're a tent keeper, you're not able to go around and make some money on the side because things are feeling good economically. It's a bit of a boom at that point. So Jesus is able to do what he does. Christianity is able to do what it does because of the Pax Romana. So, it would be impossible to overstate the importance of the Greco-Roman context of the New Testament. We cannot read the Scripture and understand it well if we just look at it, not at surface level. Surface level, it's great. You're going to understand how to receive salvation. I talked about this last week. If you have your tube television, you're going to see the story. You're going to be able to watch the Jesus movie, and you're going to be able to receive salvation, right? But what I want you to do is to have a clearer picture, a greater resolution, so that when you're seeing the political movements that are going on in Jesus' time, you can then extrapolate that and go, all right, what does that mean for my political moment? What does that mean for my life as a Christian today? Jesus operated in this way with his contemporaries. Now I ought to be able to operate this way with my contemporaries. So if we have a greater resolution, and so as we're looking at it, we want to understand the Greco-Roman context. The Pax Romana makes the events of the New Testament possible, especially the promulgation of Christianity. People can travel around, people can move, people can groove. So it's absolutely crucial that Jesus was born at this time. And as, good Reformed believers, if you're going to put yourself under that umbrella, we are heavy on the sovereignty of God, right? It would be, we would say it's no mistake. We would say it's not an accident. God didn't get lucky by being born at this time, He chose Mary for the exact time. This is a very Esther kind of idea. You were born at this time, for this moment, right? God chose you to do this thing. So we believe that God in his sovereignty brought about the ministry of Christ at this particular time so that it could grow. So kind of a review to kind of walk through these first 3 weeks, because we've talked about a few different areas. We talked about the cultural influences of the Greeks. Now, I wasn't alive during the Cold War, which was not a Pax Romana, right? But what I know about that point, at that point, one of our biggest exports as Americans, as America, was culture. We had movies, we had blue jeans, we had Coca-Cola. And if you don't know this, there was an underground smuggling of denim jeans into the Soviet Union, right?
And Mattel.
You said what?
And Mattel.
And Mattel, yeah. Movies, toys, like we would take our culture and it was being exported. It was a soft influence on Russian people. So I want denim, please. Bring me Levi, right? So they want to bring in. And so imagine this is what Greek culture is. It is cool. It is the movies that we watch. It is the television shows. It is the clothes that we wear that is influencing our lives. Hellenization is very much the same way. It's the philosophical thought. It is the culture that is influential. It's the language that we're speaking. We're speaking Koine Greek to each other on a regular basis. And we have certain Platonic ideas and we have certain philosophies that you and I can jive with. We could talk about these things and we can intertwine. Trade is humongous during this time. The fact that I can take these goods to anywhere in the world and I could use the same exact money anywhere I go is revolutionary, right? And I can become a businessman and I can trade and I can grow. This is unheard of in a time like this. There was another quote I heard about was like, this is the first example of globalization, where nations and tribes and ethnoses are moving together and grooving together, and it's a melting pot. Now, I think the historians would say that the melting pot, the bottom of the pot got so hot that it melted and splattered everywhere. But we are looking at a time right now before Jesus' birth, where there's this beautiful cohesion where ideas can flow, money can flow, people can flow, and things can be shared on a regular basis. So you have the cultural movements that are happening. You have the Jewish religious dynamics, right? Where we're expecting God to move. God hasn't had a prophet in Palestine or in Judea for over 400 years. Malachi was the last one. What's going to happen? Well, this guy in camel clothes comes up out of the desert and he starts preaching a message. Repent and believe. The kingdom of heaven is at hand, right? And so you're getting this excitement. Oh man, God is going to begin to do something. What is he going to do? But then you have all these various ideas of how that will come about. You have certain people believing that with extreme religiosity, we're going to be able to bring God, we're going to please him enough, right? Think about what we do, how that's so counterintuitive to the Christian message. If I do something enough, God will act. If I'm righteous enough, I will act. God will act, right? So you have the Sadducees who are just they're sitting on a fence, to be honest. They're just kind of saying, we'll go along to get along. And then you have the Zealots who are stabbing people left and right? So that's my kind of group. No, I'm joking. So you have this Jewish context that Jesus is walking in, where each party, each group has expectations of what a rabbi should be, of what a Jew should be, of what holiness should be. And Jesus comes in and is going to speak into that reality. We talked about the Talmud. We talked about the kind of the Jewish phrases that are going around in this time. And we're going to look in, when we get to Jesus' ministry, we're going to see that Jesus is very Jewish. And that's such a cliche. We say that all the time. Jesus was a Jew. But the more and more that we hear his sayings, we understand what he was saying a lot of rabbinic phrases that have been common. But what he does is he takes it and he spins it towards God's kingdom. And he says, this is how God's kingdom acts. It is not how your kingdoms like to act. And then finally, we have the Romans. The Romans are oppressive. The Romans are powerful. They are vengeful. And so we're stepping into an environment, Jesus is going to step into an environment to where the political climate is at 100, right? The temperature is high. And he is going to step into that boiling water for a purpose, for a reason. Because if you remember, John chapter 11, it's better that one should die than the whole nation should die. So Jesus steps into the boiling pot of water for your sake, for my sake, so that we don't have to do this, right? He takes on the political heat, the religious heat, the cultural heat, and he says, my kingdom and I will operate in a different way. And hopefully we're going to begin to expose ourselves. Okay, how is Jesus' expectations, how is his ministry different than theirs, and then ultimately different than mine? Last thing, and then we'll head out of here. I thought it was going to be a lot cooler than it was. It's a little hot in here. We have the air conditioning. We'll have to turn it up to 11 next time. My teaching is cool. Thank you. Job it. All right. We're in a climate today in 2023 where we feel like there's never been a political climate like ours. We've never had such a confusing debacle of leadership and cultural expectations, and what are we supposed to do in a moment like this? We have bad leadership. Our Constitution is crumbling. The cultural expectations are being melted and pushed away. But I think if you were asking a Jew in that time, and if you were asking a disciple in that time, maybe more appropriate because we're all disciples, I think they would look at you and go, yeah, I know exactly what you mean. There's bad leadership. There's crazy cultural expectation. There's debauchery. At this point, when the Romans are growing, right, their pious attitudes are really melting away. They're not as pious as they once were. We're going to talk about Roman and Greek culture next week. We're going to get more into the nitty-gritty. We're going to talk about a little bit of the philosophy. We're going to talk about the religion. We're going to talk about some of their ethics. And we're going to see that Christianity comes as a breath of fresh air. Christianity comes as a way of freedom. And when you look at your gods and they're vile and they're sexually assaulting people on a regular basis, and culture is crumbling around you, and you're going to look at the call of Christ as a lighter yoke. You're going to look at it and go, that's the way I want to live. That's a pious living that I want to step into. And I'm not doing it in order to have God do something on my behalf. I'm not trying to coerce God, but I'm stepping into it because I go, he's the king, his reign will be, and we will submit to him no matter what the situation will be. So we're stepping into a very tumultuous situation as Jesus steps onto the Palestinian dirt. And we're going to see how he operates and he lives in this world. Sound good? Any questions? Brittany.
You might talk about this next week, but were there ways that you feel like Jesus engaged
Yeah, I mean, you look at one of the famous situations of like, how does he think about the Roman Empire? They ask him about taxes. And they say, what should we do about taxes? He says, render unto Caesar what is Caesar's and render unto God what is God's, right? And I think that there's ultimately this idea of like, what is our response to authority? What is our response to a worldly authority that is absolutely opposed to our way of living and our way of life? I think you could be like a zealot, and you could say, who believed that taxation was wrong, right? And if you're a libertarian, you might be going, hey, zealots kind of got something right? So the zealots are saying, no, we shouldn't be doing that. The Sadducees are glad to take the taxes because it's a temple tax, and they just want it for themselves, so they're kind of enriching themselves. But I don't think that Jesus is trying to say, just forget about government. But I think he's saying, you're in the world you're in. You kind of have to you have to participate in it. You're not an Essene, you can't just run away. You're not a zealot, you just can't fight it, right? You have to step into this thing. But ultimately, your highest authority, your highest desire is to give God what belongs to God, right? And so, I mean, the image of that, well, literally the image of that, who's on the coin? Caesar, right? So you render that image onto Caesar. What's on this coin? God's image, right? So I render unto God, I pay my tax by giving myself to God. And I think there's, that'd probably be the most obvious way, but more so he's going to be dealing with the political context within the Jewish world, right? Like the Romans are obviously there. There's Roman soldiers that he heals one of their servants, and he doesn't look at them and say, hey, walk away, get away from me. But he says, yeah, your servant is healed, right? When we look at the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus says, when someone slaps you in your face, turn the other cheek. When they ask for your tunic, when they ask for your cloak, give them your tunic. When they ask you to go a mile, walk another mile. And so I'd love to look more into this. I've heard this in a sermon one time, that the Romans were famous for just kind of abusing the citizens, and they would say, hey, carry my armor for me for a mile. And so there's this idea that like you were being forced by the Roman authorities to carry something that really you weren't supposed to be carrying. And so Jesus says to say, look, I'll go an extra mile for you. I'll go further for you. So I need to look into that, see if that's that context or that snippet, that idea is true. I like that idea because I think it'll preach, And so, yeah, I think Jesus is speaking to the political, but if we don't know the political environment, if we don't know what's going on, and I think when we think political, Pharisees and Sadducees are political groups in a way. These are, it's their battleground is more religion, but it's for the people. The politics is our daily lives. It's our ethics lived out. I think that's what Plato says. But so we're gonna kind of see him in many ways, kind of work with the dynamics of people. Does that answer your question? That was a long way to answer that. Other questions? That's our time. We're 2 minutes early. I'm going to give you these 2 minutes. That's how nice I am. All right. Thank you all for coming here. Be blessed. Appreciate you guys. Till next week.